I have always been fascinated with cryptozoology, so imagine my excitement when I found out that my late grandfather had apparently had an encounter with something very strange. This story takes place during the time that he lived in the Soviet Union. At the time, my grandfather was an electrical engineer, and one day he got called to a town in southern Siberia near the shores of Lake Baikal. Among other things, Lake Baikal is known for having an incredible ecosystem of thousands of species, half of which are found nowhere else in the world. It's also the center for all manner of legends and creepy stories. So my grandfather arrives in town, near the lake, but by the time he gets there, it's already getting dark, so his client insists that he stay the night in the Gostinitsa, but not before he invites my grandfather to supper. Over a meager meal, the two discuss the details of the work that my grandfather has been hired to do. They brainstorm some solutions as the sky begins to darken. At this point, the client, who has seemed very level-headed up until then, makes what seems like an odd remark. "Do take care," he says to my grandfather, "not to leave your room in the Gostinitsa during the night. There are creatures out there." My grandfather glanced at the client's glass of vodka, thinking perhaps the man had had one too many. "What do you mean by creatures?" my grandfather asked. After some hesitation, the client asked my grandfather not to mention what he was about to say to anyone. "Around the forests, we sometimes find huge mounds of animal droppings containing whole skeletons entirely intact. These droppings are left by giant snakes that live in the lake." My grandfather, naturally, was skeptical about this story. For one, why would a snake venture into a freezing cold lake such as Lake Baikal? It didn't strike him as being very likely, although it would make sense for such a creature to reside in a burrow underground. The client continued, "People come across these mounds often, although sightings of the creature are not very common. We receive reports of people having seen it maybe once or twice a year. We suspect the reason for that is, well, human bones are also found in the droppings, and when a set of human bones are found, reports of a missing person are never far behind." There was an awkward pause, and the client stammered a bit. "But, try not to think too much about what I've just told you. Just stay in your room for the night, and try and get a good night's rest." My grandfather had no trouble putting it out of his mind. He later told my father, who told me, the whole thing stunk of you-know-what. So giving the whole silly matter no more thought, he changed into his nightclothes and opened the window to the little room to let in a cool breeze. He sat at the little desk near the window and studied the schematics for the next day's job. When he was satisfied that he had everything figured out, he stood up to extinguish the light and get some sleep. But when he shut off the light and turned towards his bed, he saw, peeking through the opened window, the head of an enormous snake, illuminated by the moonlight, its tongue flicking up and down inside the room. Instantly, my grandfather darted away from the window. The closet was just behind him, and he ran inside and shut the door. Then, he began to hear violent thrashing. It sounded as though large men were charging at the walls and at the furniture. He heard the shattering of wood. The whole thing couldn't have lasted more than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. The crashing stopped, and everything went silent. Then, my grandfather heard pounding at the door to his hotel room.
"What the hell is going on in there? You've woken everybody up. I'm calling the police."
At this point, my grandfather rushed out of the closet, through the wrecked room, and out into the hallway, slamming the door behind him. Immediately, he was accosted by the owner, who wouldn't let him go until the police arrived. When they did, they began to inspect the room, or what was left of it anyway. The furniture had been reduced to splinters, and my grandfather's papers, his schematics, and other notes were lying all over the place. The police told the owner to give my grandfather a different room for the night, and one of them pulled my grandfather aside to talk to him. "Don't open your window again," he said. "We don't want to have to come back tonight to recover a body, or worse." The rest of the trip went uneventfully. My grandfather completed the job that he had been hired to do, and promptly returned to Ukraine, where he and my father, who was then in his early youth, both lived. But that's not where the story ends. My grandfather, without telling anybody, brought something back with him from the Gostinitsa. One day, my grandfather takes a trip to the Museum of Natural History, and he brings with him the object that he secretly brought back with him. My father said that he carried it in between the pages of a book, which I suppose means that it was probably a scale from the giant snake. My grandfather shows it to the curator at the museum, who shows great interest in it. My grandfather relates the story of how he got it, as the curator inspects the object excitedly. He asks my grandfather if he can hang on to it to conduct some research, and ensures him that he'll show him his findings. My grandfather accepts and parts with the object. But the curator never did get back to him. After going through some trouble to track him down, my grandfather finally managed to get back in touch with the curator, but the man responded almost angrily to being questioned about the item and his research on it. "That thing you brought me was a hoax, and nothing more. I've decided I want nothing to do with that damned fake, and I suggest you make up your mind to do the same." That's the story. What made it even stranger to me was that just before I heard it, I had also heard about all sorts of strange things going on in and around Lake Baikal, although never anything quite like this. The only thing I ever found that was even remotely similar was a single isolated mention of a possible Nessie-type creature, a plesiosaur, that might have entered the ecosystem through one of the many rivers that feed the lake. One of those things could certainly be mistaken for a giant snake. Anyway, it's quite the peculiar affair, don't you think? What's hiding, or perhaps what's being hidden, at Lake Baikal?